Hello, my name is Avery Ash. I am the Executive Director for the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. We are a global initiative of SAFE. We look to advance a vision for how new mobility technologies and services are going to shape transportation outcomes that are better for people and the planet. We look to identify how to enable this vision through research and policy advocacy in the US and Europe, and are ultimately looking to improve transportation systems to move people, goods, to make them more sustainable, secure, more equitable, and more efficient. We have an exciting new report that we're here to discuss today. This new case study builds on SAFE's work through our Center for Automated Transportation Technology and shows how widespread deployment of autonomous vehicles can provide a safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable mobility option for people while making the transportation system more resilient. This report helps to shine a light on the critical issues of air and noise pollution in our cities. As we know, urbanization is reshaping our world. As cities expand and grow, they grapple with the unintended consequences of increased air and noise pollution. And these implications go beyond academic discourse. They have direct impact on the way our cities are shaped in coming years. This study uncovers how electric shared autonomous vehicles, or SAVs, are poised to play a transformative role in air and noise pollution mitigation. We've got a great panel here for you today. Each panelist brings invaluable expertise to today's discussion. And again, this is not just about talking, it's about finding solutions, it's about sharing insights, and it's about addressing the real-world challenges posed by air and noise pollution in our cities through the deployment of electric SAVs. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Tara Andringa, who is our moderator today. Tara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Avery. It is a thrill and an honor to moderate this panel today. And I am excited to share the virtual stage with three brilliant women leaders, all of whom, in addition to having an incredible wealth of experience, are all PhDs. So we're looking forward to a really engaging conversation. Given each panelist's breadth of experience, we wanted to introduce each panelist by posing a question that allows them to reflect on the report within the context of their expertise in this space. So wanted to first introduce Dr. Nadia Anderson, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy Strategy at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for being here today. Silicon Valley is a hub for technological innovation. In your view, how does sustainability align with Silicon Valley's broader objectives and technological innovation initiatives?
Thank you, Tara. I want to echo the sentiment and say it is an absolute pleasure to be here today. So both thank you and SAFE for the opportunity to join this conversation. Now, before I answer your question, I want to share a little bit about SVLG to sort of ground my comments so you know where I'm coming from. So the Silicon Valley Leadership Group is the nation's most effective and dynamic business association. Our members represent the innovation economy and its ecosystem. So think household names like Google, Meta, Microsoft, Adobe, but also legacy institutions and organizations like Stanford University and Pacific Gas and Electric, not to mention some nonprofits and startups are in the mix as well. So essentially companies that are at the forefront of new technologies like automation, AI, innovative healthcare, education, and sustainability. So when it comes to sustainability, we all know that California tends to be king and has been a leader on sustainability for quite a while. Those of you can think back to CAFE and the fact that CARB had its own standards that people could abide by. Now, this legacy directly aligns with how we think about sustainability today in the Valley, both from the work and how our members approach the subject, and many others in the region and the state are also on board with this. So for simplicity, it shows up in our work in two main ways. First, Silicon Valley is always looking for tough problems or challenges to solve. And the fact that it hasn't been done before does not stop us. For example, for at least a decade, California has been working to show that you can focus on reducing emissions from the transportation sector and also do so in a manner that brings communities and populations affected by poor air quality alone and sort of center them. Silicon Valley is the home of many self-driving car companies in addition to renewables and different ways of making sure that energy is efficient. The other way that it shows up is we have a unique ability to be very multidisciplinary in our approach and break down silos, and we get things done when it comes to public policy. So this includes doing innovative things when it comes to public-private partnerships and being very active when it comes to figuring out what's next when it comes to sustainable growth, but also making sure that, again, we are addressing some of the legacy issues when it comes to energy, the environment, and climate. So what you can see from our members is a very close alignment with sustainability goals. And our members do business in this way. It's how they show up. It's how we engage in public policy. And it's also how we engage in the cities and communities we serve. And I absolutely expect this to continue because California takes pride in being sort of a leader on climate, but also being at the cutting edge when it comes to technology and innovation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Next, wanted to introduce Dr. Regan Patterson, who is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at UCLA. Dr. Patterson, you bring a breadth of knowledge as an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering and is the PI of the Engineering Environmental Justice Lab. Can you share your thoughts on why we should prioritize addressing environmental issues such as air and noise pollution? And also, how do these concerns intersect with broader social and economic challenges?
Hi. First, thank you so much for including me in this talk. It is an honor, a true honor to be here among Dr. Whitmore and Dr. Anderson. So thank you so much for including me and I'm so excited by this study. I have a lot of bias in my response because that is exactly what my research focuses on. So as you mentioned, I am the PI of the Engineering Environmental Justice Lab at UCLA, where my research really focuses on that intersection of air quality engineering, transportation, and environmental justice. And so when we ask and look at air pollution and noise pollution, it's really critical to look at these things because disproportionate exposure to both air and noise pollution are very well documented. And so study after study has shown how there are disproportionate exposures to traffic-related air pollution, particularly PM 2.5, black carbon, nitrogen dioxide, with studies showing for instance, 28% disparity in exposure to NO2, which is heavily dominated by one of the major sources are both light duty and heavy duty vehicles. And then when we talk about this and relating it in terms of access as well, we see that those communities that are disproportionately exposed to air pollution are the same communities that lack equitable access to mobility options and access to services. And so it's the very same communities that kind of have this double burden of being disproportionately exposed to air and noise pollution, as well as not having the mobility options and the access. And so when we're trying to look at communities and improving from a transportation lens, it's important to consider holistically the environmental exposures as well as that accessibility piece, particularly when we're talking about access to jobs, access to services such as healthcare, such as the grocery store, and things that are very important to both economic aspects of livelihood, but also just livelihoods in general. So really looking at the holistic experience of these communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson. And finally, I want to introduce Dr. Allanté Whitmore, who is the director of the Autonomous Vehicle Initiative at SAFE. Dr. Whitmore, you lead the AV initiative. Can you give us the big picture overview? What prompted SAFE's interest in this topic?
Absolutely, and thank you, Tara, for moderating this panel. I'm so happy to be here. Since 2014, SAFE has had an increased interest and increasingly viewed connected, autonomous, shared, and electric vehicles as a critical piece of our future transportation system. And we've been producing work around workforce benefits, around increasing access for people with disabilities, around environmental and equity and access implications since then. And what we realized and what we understand is that there's potential in the United States for economic and societal advancement on a scale unseen since the invention of the automobile itself. And so the Center for Automated Transportation Technology, we lead the effort to study and quantify many of these benefits that these new technologies can offer. And so when we were starting to explore our work this year, we really wanted to continue that legacy of work that we've done and include and look at how cities can be impacted, like one particular city versus some of our work that's been more of a high level view or at the federal level, but being able to articulate specifically how one city and the communities within that city can have better access. And in the environmental justice space and in the environmental studies space, air pollution, we all are very aware of how air pollution impacts us, impacts the communities, impacts low income and BIPOC communities. However, what we found really intriguing and we think is worth more discussion was the noise pollution piece. Noise pollution is a major factor, and there are public health linkages to the lack of having noise in your surroundings and in your community. And so we really wanted to use this opportunity to show how shared autonomous vehicles, or SAVs, can be a part of the solution in mitigating air and noise pollution. And so we were really excited for this opportunity to do this work and showcase really, again, the benefits of this new technology.
Thank you so much, Allanté. It's a really interesting topic. Thank you for pulling this discussion together, and really excited to dive in a bit deeper. As Allanté mentioned, the report covers a breadth of topics. So to frame our discussion, we wanted to divide the conversation into some of the broad themes of the report. So we'll look at air and noise pollution, equity and implications of electric shared AVs, and finally some policy implications and takeaways. So we'll begin with the air and noise pollution. And Allanté, wanted to go back to you just to get a little bit more detail on this study. Could you explain why it's important to consider both air and noise pollution together in the context of electric shared autonomous vehicles? And also, what were the most significant findings regarding their impact on air and noise pollution in your study?
Absolutely. As I shared, there's multiple studies that already exist talking about how shared autonomous vehicles can support efforts towards a more sustainable future. And we've looked at things already like efficiency gains and safety, where we find a large breadth of knowledge. But we, excuse me, we picked autonomous vehicles can enhance reductions in air noise pollution through first the electric powertrain. In our analysis and in the world that we, as I've shared, SAFE views connected, autonomous, shared electric vehicles joined together. And so any autonomous vehicle will have an electric powertrain. And when we did our study, we found that when we had a 6.6 fleet, vehicle AV fleet, so that's 6.6 of the entire San Francisco vehicle fleet was shared autonomous vehicles, that led to a 41% decrease in particulate matter. Secondly, a benefit of autonomous vehicles is that there are fewer ICE vehicles on the road, which means there are quieter roads. That's the name of our panel today. Lastly, SAVs introduce vehicle design, and they incentivize higher vehicle utilization, which also will significantly reduce noise levels. And so we found in our case study that the same SAV fleet, the 6.6% fleet, delivers a 60% decrease in noise polluting trips. And so we see this tremendous potential for quieter roads, clearer skies through this technology. And so it's a really incredible finding, and also speaks to the tremendous potential of shared autonomous mobility.
Wonderful, thank you. And Regan, in your opinion, what role does community engagement and advocacy play in ensuring that policies and initiatives to reduce air and noise pollution are equitable and effectively address environmental justice concerns?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question and bringing the community engagement piece. And so community engagement is really important in terms of equitable deployment of these technologies, and also getting to what does the introduction of such technology serve. And so it's really important in problem identification. And so the person developing the technology, the folks deploying the technology, might see one purpose for this. However, that may or may not be the same as those who are actually experiencing a problem, or the problem that has been identified that this technology will serve. And so really getting that community perspective on what is the purpose, how will this serve, how will this address issues of access to mobility, as well as access to goods and services. And so making sure that that deployment really serves when we talk about folks are or are not using something, or are not adopting a certain technology. Really, it comes down to, is it serving what the community has identified as the real need in that community? And so making sure that the deployment of such technology, and so this case, the shared autonomous electric vehicles, making sure that that really serves what the community sees as what it can serve. And so getting that from the beginning. So at the very beginning stages of when we're introducing this into communities, making sure that that voice is elevated in the conversation, because it is then that it will be deployed equitably and truly to the service of the communities that we hope to benefit.
Excellent points. Thank you. And Nadia, from a business and technology perspective, how can advancements in autonomous and electric vehicles contribute to mitigating air noise pollution in urban areas? And what, if any, incentives exist for the private sector to invest in these solutions?
No, another excellent question. I would say that the short answer is that these advancements have the potential to be game-changing for how the private sector engages and interacts within this space. For example, it helps things with economies of scale. It also helps make things wider available, which we know can have reach into different communities and populations that may not have been able to touch or experience or engage with either autonomous or electric vehicles. And there are a number of reasons and incentives why our member companies are like sort of ahead of the curve in moving towards things like EVs and AVs and things where they make sense. And one of the things is that a lot of the employees that work for the companies expect it. So when you think about a corporation's fleet, many of the people who work there are looking to make sure that they're reducing their carbon footprint as well. And that's the reason why they've engaged with the mission and vision of the company. So we see a lot of our member companies transitioning their own fleets over to EVs. Also, that there is a lot of expectation and growth when you think about the company's reputation and brand that they want to have. A lot of these vehicles are out in the community and going around doing their day-to-day jobs, and they want to be as respectful as possible, but also make sure that they're aligned with best practices and leading towards, that better environment in future. So reducing the noise, reducing the emissions that are there because they are zero emission or electric vehicles as well. So I'd say there's lots of reasons why the private sector is engaged in this space, but also moving. I'd be remiss as a policy person to not also talk about the role of policy and incentives. So incentives are absolutely helpful for not only the private sector engaging, but also getting more members of the general population to touch and engage. And incentives don't always have to be financial. Financial always helps. People worry about their coins a lot on all fronts. So it definitely makes sense. But things like having access to free parking, or having access to high occupancy vehicle lanes, or being able to take advantage of some of the other, I would say, intangible benefits of being an early adopter and making sure that you're having a technology or mobility option that mitigates some of the challenges you face. There are many things that can be done to make a person, more interested in, or even to continue to encourage the private sector to continue to invest in these technologies in a real and substantial way.
For sure. I really like your point about looking at incentives broadly. Next, wanted to look at the equity implications of electric SAVs and the disparities that were identified in the report that Allanté talked about. Rick, I want to just start with you on this one. From your perspective, how might increased shared AV adoption in underserved communities contribute to broader economic and social equity objectives in this region?
Yeah, so something that immediately comes to mind is really filling the gaps in public transit. And so when we look at which communities are most reliant on public transit, what communities have less access to privately owned vehicles, that is really a place where electric SAVs can really serve, and filling those gaps and providing increased access. When we talk about the economic piece, increased access to jobs, as well as other services that also put a financial burden on households, such as healthcare, getting to the grocery store, getting to employment centers. And so there's been experiments with fixed route electric share SAVs. There's been experiments with varying routes. And so a fixed route example could be something that gets folks from residential areas to employment centers. That is an opportunity to, again, expand economic opportunities. And then, again, helping support and complement public transit with getting folks to public transport, or just filling gaps where there isn't any at all. And so really increasing mobility, because by increasing mobility, you increase those economic opportunities.
Great, thank you so much. And then Allanté, curious, how did your study assess the equity implications of SAV deployment? And also, what specific measures indicate the potential for improved air noise quality in underserved areas?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. And so I want to share a couple of measures that were included in the study. First, we looked at PM 2.5, which is inhalable fine particulate matter, and it is a key health risk factor in air pollution studies because it can induce these adverse health effects that we shared before. And so that was the first measure we looked at. Second, we included low income populations and BIPOC communities, as they are a common socio-demographic metric to underline the equity implications in this work. And finally, in our case study, we introduced noise polluting trips, so as a metric. So these are trips that are quiet because they are electric, and we looked at this as a metric of all the trips available to the city of San Francisco, both by privately owned vehicles and our electric SAV fleet that was in the analysis. And so what we found is 24 census tracts that had higher concentrations of low-income communities and BIPOC communities in San Francisco, and we compared their outcomes to the rest of the city. And we found that most notably, the PM 2.5 decreased by 50% in some of these communities, which means that there's actually a better air quality mitigation impact and environmental impact in those communities and neighborhoods over the city average, where they are also disproportionately impacted by air quality. So this is a really positive outcome from our work. Secondly, there was a 40% decline on noise pollution in these communities. It's not as great as the city average of 60%, but it's also worth noting from our baseline work, we found that in these areas where there's actually lower vehicle ownership, these are the communities that are also having the most noise pollution. So any reduction in noise pollution is still really significant and welcome, I'm sure, in these neighborhoods. And I think to Dr. Patterson's point, having a new opportunity, a new access tool in their transportation suite of options is going to also provide a lot of positive impact. And I won't belabor her point, but I think that's another really important piece of scaling deployment of autonomous vehicles, is that we can then provide service where it's most needed.
Great, thank you so much. And Nadia, as shared AVs bring more equitable access to clean transportation, what role can the technology industry, represented by Silicon Valley, play in ensuring equitable deployment?
No, I would say the tech industry in Silicon Valley have the potential to play a very important role when it comes to making sure our SAVs are available and accessible as a clean transportation option, and that they're also able to overcome some of the mobility challenges we've seen based on how cities and communities have been designed in the past. And what we see are many companies are doing the work, as we like to say, in order to make sure that those missteps are not repeated and that they meet the moment that's before them with technology and innovation sort of like converging in these vehicles and different mobility options. Now, when it comes to access, as Dr. Whitmore said, there are a number of companies who are looking to design vehicles from the ground up differently and thinking about how you can help make sure people can travel in better ways. This means including things like wheelchair, power chair ramps, different access points, making sure people with low or no vision are able to sort of navigate and use the innovative designs and features that are there. And we also have companies who are adopting best practices when it comes to the equitable deployment. As Dr. Patterson mentioned, this means taking, more of a research approach and applying some of those methods and strategies that marketing fields use in order to do focus groups, direct engagement, appealing to the traveler based on what they say their needs are, rather than taking sort of a blanket approach or making these like widespread assumptions. Now, as a public policy person, again, I'm going to say that the government also has, a key role to play here. But I do think with the speed of how things are moving, the private sector and leaders in Silicon Valley are very well positioned to design and deploy SAVs in a way that is truly equitable. And I will say I'm personally heartened to see so many companies taking different and new approaches to how they think about the technology, but also how they introduce and educate the general population and the public about what's happening, the potential benefits as they see them, and having more of a dialogue as opposed to blind deployment in some of the ways that we've seen in the past.
Thank you so much. And want to stick with your point about policy for a minute. We really wanted to look at some policy and practical considerations. Actually, would love for all of you to reflect on this. Curious what key policy recommendations or strategies you believe should be considered by cities and policymakers looking to implement SAVs for environmental and equity purposes. Would love to hear all of your thoughts. Allanté, do you want to lead off?
Absolutely. And so I think the one great opportunity and one recommendation we share quite often is to incentivize, as Dr. Anderson just shared, incentivize uptake. And so this, what do I mean when I say that? This is tying the incentives. I think that public transit agencies and our federal government and cities have an opportunity right now with these companies to leverage the desire to scale, and leverage that by tying some of the success to equity measures, to environmental sustainability measures and goals for these cities. And so I think what's helpful would be to really think deeply about what those incentives are at each level, at the federal level, at the state level, and at the city level, to determine how those goals are written and those incentives are created for these companies to operate on the roads. Additionally, I think Nadia made a great point about also creating incentives for riders and for people to touch and engage with these new technologies. And so we really really focusing on that opportunity. And I think that if we are able to really drill down and have conversations about what those incentives might look like, we can absolutely have this really positive outcome. And I think using the technology that we hope to within a tool within our toolkit of mobility options to improve access, to improve and mitigate some of the emissions from the transportation sector. I think all of that is possible with really thoughtful policymaking around those incentives.
Really, really great points. Regan, do you have any further comments? Same question about strategies or recommendations for policymakers?
Yeah, and so my response is really going to reiterate my response in the previous question and how we deploy these. And so on the city level, whether it is a pilot or whether it is longer term deployment, making sure that the process is equitable in terms of community engagement, and then also making sure that it really does fill the gaps. And so when we talk about our public or our public transportation departments, our departments of transportation at that local level, really making sure that the way in which it is deployed is filling gaps, starting with those community engaged processes, and then making sure that they complement the services that are existing and really increase access to mobility and access to services. And so really my response is from a policy perspective, the process of deployment behind these policies, making sure that process is equitable, that process is community engaged, and that process particularly targets those transportation gaps and mobility gaps.
Wonderful, thank you. And Nadia, you've already shared some policy insights. Do you have anything additional to add on that front?
So one quick recommendation and one quick sort of strategic approach. So the recommendation for folks at the city level and policymakers in general is to have open and honest conversations with the private sector and those who are working to solve problems and develop and deploy and test the technology, because a lot of times what I've found and seen is that there's a little bit of daylight between both sides' perspectives and point of view. And if you can have those conversations, you can get to a place where good policy can happen, where you're solving the goal, where you're protecting the general public, but you're also promoting innovation and competitiveness. So those things could be done. So I'd say open conversations is a recommendation. Take the time to talk and understand before, picking up the power of the pen or using the power of the purse, as, policymakers do. When it comes to like the strategy associated with it, I would say be outcomes focused as opposed to overly prescriptive. I mentioned it earlier in my comments, Silicon Valley is full of problem solvers. And, I've learned the hard way that person solving a problem doesn't like to be told how to do it, but more able to ideate, to experiment, to innovate, to figure out different ways at getting at it. So allowing for a little bit of experimentation where it makes sense, but also focusing on what the end goal is and handing that problem over to those who are, close to the technology and understand sort of the nuance to be able to work together towards actionable solutions when it comes to policy.
For sure. Great points. Another thing you have all kind of touched on is the importance of collaboration and communication. And would love to ask each of you, how can collaborative efforts between all these groups, between environmental advocates and the private sector and policymakers, how can that collaboration contribute to achieving a balance between technological advancements and environmental sustainability, specifically in terms of air and noise pollution? Regan, do you want to touch on that one first?
Sure. Really, again, reemphasizing where is the problem identification starting, And so when we are deploying technology, as Dr. Whitmore mentioned, uptake, if we really want that uptake, we really need to make sure it's deployed in a way that's serving the communities that we want to serve. And so to get everyone together, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, focus groups, having those conversations about what need is this addressing? What is the explicit need in the community that this is addressing? There's no blanket approach, but environmental advocates from various communities have various issues and various challenges that that the deployment of electric SAVs can help solve. And so it's going to really take that bottom-up, collaborative, conversation, community-driven process to really ensure that everyone is talking to each other and that there is that equitable deployment. So really making sure, as I like to say, community-driven conversations and having conversations with multi-stakeholders that begin with that problem identification coming from community.
Fantastic. And Nadia, from the business vantage point, what thoughts do you have on that front?
No, I totally agree with everything Dr. Patterson said. I think collaboration is also key, and it's that identifying the problem together, but also doing a little bit of checking and rechecking. So there should be milestones and benchmarks, and making sure that, you know, the policy, the action is aligned with the desired outcomes, and then also being open to going back and starting again if you're learning or seeing something that's not working out the way that you thought it would. And it has to be a collaborative relationship, I would say, of equals who are equally invested towards that goal as well. So making sure that you all are aligned and everybody at the table is aligned on mission and vision, because I think we all maybe agree that if SAVs are going to work and be deployed, it has to be a mutually beneficial partnership amongst all parties and stakeholders that are going to touch, and that deploying this in a silo on either side is not going to lead to the outcomes that we want.
Great, thank you. And then Allanté, I'm curious both of you about your thoughts about this and also the report's findings and insights on the importance of collaboration.
Yes, I think that it's going to be really important. And Dr. Anderson and Dr. Patterson honestly really hit the nail on the head with that one. I believe that everyone needs to be at the table. There has to be a conversation about not only the needs of the community, the needs of the community, and then extrapolating to the city and state level, but also having a conversation with those that are close to technology about what its capabilities are, the capacity, the opportunities to scale, and in that, then devising a plan that has those benchmarks, those milestones, and being okay with iteration. I think the wonderful thing about this approach is that it provides an opportunity to document not only what's desired, and from that, being able to assess what has happened and then iterate to improve and get closer and closer to that target. And so I think that's where having everyone come into the conversation about what's needed and then devising a plan is going to be the most beneficial approach for this technology. And so, and also being okay with and open to this iterative process. I think that's going to be really critical as this industry continues to develop, as people continue to become comfortable and familiar with the technology and understand that it's not a one-time activity. This is going to be a continuous positive feedback loop.
Great, thank you. And before we run out of time, I want to hit some questions that we got from the audience. Some people wrote, and a lot of these are topics we've sort of touched on, but want to be sure we address them. One is about community engagement. And this viewer wrote in, how do you all approach creating an equitable community engagement strategy to discuss automation and AV in our neighborhoods? Any of you want to take a stab at that one?
I don't mind starting, because I'm going to start with the wonderful work that you do at PAVE, Tara. I'm proud to be the vice chair of the board at PAVE. And in that work, I think PAVE does a really great job of being intentional about engaging the community, from education of programming. We had a high school essay contest this year that really allowed individuals to think about their future with AVs and engaging at that level, which is really important, because these are the next generation of thought leaders and people who are going to carry out the work that we're even starting now. I also think about my time in Pittsburgh. I was a part of the Micromobility Collective, which was also the Move PGH work. And in that work, found like I had a really great example of what it looks like to have all types of stakeholders in the room having a conversation and thinking really deeply about how to create a suite of options. There was car share services, there were scooters, there were bikes, there were, of course, our existing public transit. So thinking about, again, how to be really intentional about supporting and identifying where the need is and providing that support there, and having stakeholders who can say, this is what we need. Sometimes the answer might not always be the technology, and that's okay, because the technology is there to support where needed. And so those are two examples of where I think the education piece happens really, really well, and on with PAVE, and then also just sharing my experience in Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you for mentioning PAVE. And we are so honored for your leadership there. I would love to hear from Regan and Nadia too, if you have any further thoughts on this issue. One thing I kind of would just like to dig a little deeper. This isn't the question the person asked, but one of the things we struggle with at PAVE is people have busy lives and they have kids and jobs and stresses and bills to pay. And to try to get people to engage in this topic that seems kind of so foreign to a lot of people, especially if they don't live in communities where AVs exist, sort of how you engage with people whose bandwidth is already pretty full. Would love to hear your thoughts on kind of sticking with this, engagement strategy.
Yeah, I can jump in and kick it off on that part of the question. I think that part of it has to start at the community. You have to go to the neighborhood and take the time to talk. It's one of those situations too where you have to address the need and the situation and condition that's there. So people do lead busy lives. So when you're thinking about having a meeting, maybe not have it in the middle of the day because people are doing other things in the middle of the day. Maybe have it in the evening and maybe provide food or provide an incentive to come. I think back to my days in grad school where we were starting civic associations. In our first meeting, we would have food, we would have childcare, we would address the things that we knew were going to be the barriers to come. And we also made it worth their while. Another strategy that's out there is you have to work to build trust. So if I'm going to spend my time and talk to you about what's happening, I need to know that you're going to actually use this information and do something with it that addresses my need. So sometimes it means showing up in community events and being sort of a listener and observer in order to make sure that people show and know that you are invested in the actual community. And that's how you get that rich feedback and engagement. In a lot of my jobs, I spend a lot of time sitting in the local police precinct or even joining nonprofits for the markets that I covered, because you need to understand what's happening if you want to be able to engage, and then also want to be able to build trust, to be able to put policies and practices in place that can address, the equitable deployment or education and awareness. It's a lot of building that social capital up front before you can go and get the work done that's there. So I would say that's the approach that I take personally, but it's also the approach that I bring to the private sector and the roles that I sit in. So not being afraid to break out of my corporate office or wherever I'm sitting and go and actually learn about what's happening to the people in the communities that we want to serve, and also building some real relationships there in order to be able to get to a point where you can actually effectuate, positive change or work together on some very hard challenges.
Brilliantly said. Dr. Patterson, did you have anything to add on this point?
Yes, if this was a text thread, I definitely would have exclamation point reaction to everything that was just said. I want to emphasize, or I should say re-emphasize, the point that was just made around building trust. And so this is not a one-off. This is not something where in the research world, we call it helicopter science, but we just go in and you come out. And so building that trust, and that leads to the second great point that was made around it cannot be extractive. If you're going to engage with community, the community needs to see something and working towards something. And as Dr. Whitmore mentioned, it may not be the technology, but something should come out of this where the community is seeing that the input and the time is resulting in something that will benefit the community and come back to the community. I'll just add the paid the childcare and compensating folks for their time, because it does take time to go to a meeting. And this meeting is not the only meeting. There are a lot of meetings that are happening to address various different things. So making sure that the community members are compensated for their time. And then the thing that I'll add also is location. And so often we'll say, oh, we'll have a meeting at my building. or we'll have a meeting somewhere, but making sure that that location, we've been talking about it, access and accessibility, making sure it's a location that is accessible, that community members can easily access in the time of day, but also in the location of that meeting. And so really making sure that we're compensating folks, we're considering their time, we're considering their effort, and we're not doing these extractive processes, but really bringing something back tangible for community. And it may be an iterative thing where we say we learned this and now we're going to come back, but it's that continued engagement that is really necessary and key.
Exceptional points. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll try to go to another question from the audience. Someone else wrote in, considering the focus on autonomous and electric vehicles, does it seem more practical to promote the use of shared and sustainable mobility options rather than solely attempting to transition individuals from private cars to public transit? How can technology and policy support such a shift in behavior? Any reactions to that question?
I'll start with it's a both and. Oh, Dr. Whitmore, you were going to say something? Definitely a both and, where we need to be investing in our public transportation system, and electric shared autonomous vehicles can definitely complement that as well. And so it's definitely not a dichotomy between electric shared autonomous vehicles and public transport. I think it's both moving towards this shared transport and away from a automobile transport system that is dominated by the single occupancy vehicles. And so public transport and electric shared autonomous vehicles, I believe, if deployed equitably, should really be deployed in a way that complements each other. So a both and.
No, I completely agree, Dr. Patterson, and I 100% agree with you. This is the work that I looked at in my dissertation work, and how we can absolutely integrate autonomous vehicles into existing public transit. And I think it's about, again, not always, we're thinking about one, behavior change in America, where we do have a big car culture here. And I think this is about creating opportunities and creating a freedom of choice and creating more options and creating attractive options for individuals that might be an alternate to their privately owned vehicle right now. And so that's where I think SAVs fit into the picture of having, again, a new option within your suite of mobility choices and saying, I find this attractive, I'm excited to use it, it gets me where I need to go. And then maybe considering in the future, do you need to own your own vehicle? Maybe because this will completely satisfy your mobility needs and encourages you to use public transit more. I know there's a division in the research around TNCs, or transportation network companies, and their impact on public transit use, but in some places that is actually a behavior shift that happens. And so again, thinking about how AVs from the policymaker's perspective is a tool in their toolkit towards behavior shift, and then from the consumer perspective, thinking about it as a new option that might be able to replace their existing privately owned vehicle.
Yeah, and I would just add, to double click on that point about how challenging behavior change is and how ingrained some things are in our culture. So it's going to take a measure of grace and patience in there. And I want to double click on what was said about like the opportunity and the choice, but also add agency into that equation as well. Like making sure that if you're looking at behavior change, you have to understand the suite of things that are going into why a person makes a decision and figure out ways to address all those things. And, also do it in a manner that does not reinforce a hierarchy of any sort, but also make sure that we're addressing any biases, either unforeseen or seen, that may be at play as well. So it's a very complicated thing. I think it's definitely possible. I definitely see these things complementing each other, but it is definitely more like in the social experiment range and realm of making sure that we are not removing a person's agency from being able to make a decision. And I think also, it's a little controversial of an opinion. I think that for some people, the private car is going to be what they need. I hope it's an EV and a zero emission vehicle and they progress with technology, but I also understand the root of why people sometimes feel like they need a personal car, maybe the only asset that they have, and maybe a sense of freedom and choice. So if you figure out how to address all those things that go into that decision making. And then also, again, making sure that that choice and the opportunity to engage and experience something new is there as well, and that it's attractive.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about you needing to listen to people and hearing them and their needs. I have another audience question. How do you assess the potential role of shared autonomous vehicles in replacing active modes of transportation, and what implications does this hold for mitigating environmental challenges while promoting equitable access to sustainable mobility options? Any thoughts on that one?
I think the question is like, how are we thinking about shared autonomous mobility within the scope of our active modes? And again, I think a point that we're all sharing is that, one, thinking of this as an option within your suite, your mobility suite, but also the point is not to replace another mode all the time. It's not meant to specifically say, okay, now everyone's just riding in their little shared autonomous pods to and from where they need to go, and everyone has to have a shared vehicle, and no one's walking and no one's biking. Those modes will continue to exist, but there are places that we can't all walk to. And not everyone has the ability to walk. There are places we all cannot bike to, and everyone has the ability to bike. And so, again, having an option for those who need to make that choice is going to be really important.
And something that I'll add that really underlies this entire conversation, in my opinion, is our urban planning and the planning of our transportation system. So many mobility options or lack of mobility options are because of how we have planned our communities across the nation. And I should really expand that between urban, rural, suburban, all of it. We have planned it in a way where for many, we do need a car. I live in LA, and trust me, if I had a metro that can just get me everywhere I needed to go, I would. I really would. I do not like sitting in traffic an hour and 15 minutes when without traffic, it takes 20. I don't like it. And however, because of the layout and the planning of Los Angeles, I'm in a car. Again, I should also add nuance that there is a socioeconomic and class conversation around this too, because not everyone has the ability to also own a car and finds ways to get around LA. But for those who can afford, a car is really the way we go. And so underlying this, I think, is really this is urban planning at its core, and the need to plan and replan and redesign communities where all mobility options are an option, where you can walk, bike, roll, scoot, take an electric shared autonomous vehicle. And if you still want to drive a car, okay, you can still have your car. But really making the other options really viable options. And that also is a conversation around funding. If we really value active modes, if we really value public transit, then funding it as the public good that it is, and then having all of these mobility options really, again, complement it. But it's coming down to how are we redesigning our communities, and what are we funding as the public good that they should be funded as, and how can electric shared autonomous vehicles and other mobility options really fit into that to give people an honest, true choice where I can walk, I can bike, I can scoot, I can roll, I can take a shared vehicle, I can take my privately owned vehicle. And so I think that's an underlying piece of this conversation that's really important for us to reevaluate in the US as we talk particularly about our clean energy transport futures.
Yeah, I want to echo the importance of how your neighborhood, your area, your city is designed, and what impact that has on not only your choice, but how you make those rational decisions about which mode you take. I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I live in Southeast, and Southeast is being rapidly developed, and they're adding a number of things. So there are bike lanes everywhere. There are metro stations in walkable distance. There are actually like car shares that you can like borrow, to the point that it's disincentivized me of having a personal car, because I would rarely use it, and I would just pay a lot to park it in the garage somewhere, or pay some to have it somewhere where I wouldn't like actually get the utility out of it. So my mind always goes to other modes of transportation and travel to get along. But I can also say within less than a half a mile, there is a grocery store, there's a laundromat, there's a dry cleaner. all the things that I need in my day-to-day are walkable and in distance. And so I have access to a number of things, which also further, removes that need of having like the personal owned vehicle. And for times where, I want to make that big Costco run or that big Target run, then I do find, a vehicle to get in and go get those things. But that's a rare occasion. And for me, the math didn't match, so I don't need a car there. But that's also knowing that the way that Southeast is being designed in the Navy Yard and in the wharf are very intentional in order to be able to facilitate, a car light or a car less, environment in future.
Absolutely, great points. And I love how this conversation is bringing in all the public health and urban planning and all the things we need to be thinking about for a better transportation future. We are very nearly out of time. But Dr. Patterson and Dr. Anderson and Dr. Whitmore, it has been truly a pleasure to have this conversation and your incredible points. And Dr. Whitmore, I really want to thank you for pulling this together and for all your leadership in this area. I'd like to turn it over to you for final comments and thoughts on your report that you released. Thank you so much for including me in this panel and for all of your time this evening.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this panel. I couldn't imagine it without you. And to my esteemed panelists, thank you so much for joining me in this discussion. I'm just so grateful to have a star-studded team of women having this conversation tonight. I finally want to thank the SAFE team, specifically our communications team, for all their support in getting this webinar happening, making this happen, working behind the scenes. I'd also like to thank our SAFE government affairs team for their support in this work. And I am absolutely grateful for all the support for this work. Finally, I'd like to thank Cruise for their support of this webinar and the report. And I'm sure at some point you will see a change to a closing slide where you can actually read and download our report. We'd love for you to take a look at the work that we've done here around the equity and environmental implications of shared autonomous vehicles in our case study, and you can download it. It'll also be added to the chat for you to download. Thank you all so much for your attention, and have a great night.